Well, then I'd like to call to order this January meeting of the Delaware County Juvenile Detention Board of Managers. Could we all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance wherever we are? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Because of the wintry conditions this afternoon, we are nearly all virtually today, and I will be chairing this meeting virtually. But we do have in person Councilwoman Elaine Schaefer, Chris Iserman, and Judge Nichols. The rest of us are virtual. Per usual, I will also mention that we did have an executive session, not yesterday. We had it last Thursday to cover security items and some personnel items. And with that, we can move on to public comment. I understand from Councilwoman Schaefer that we don't have any members of the public who are addressing the board today. If that changes, Councilwoman Schaefer, please let us know when it comes time for the second round of comments at the end. But moving right along, we can go to an approval of the December minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any questions or comments on the minutes from last month? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
I don't think I heard enough ayes there.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. We'll move on to our detained youth report from Juvenile Court and Probation Services. David, are you covering that today, or do we have anyone from Juvenile Probation who is addressing the board?
Yeah, Chief DiMatteo isn't able to join us today, but via her report, we have 2 young people who are in detention, both in Abraxas, Morgantown.
Do we have any questions from board members on the subject? Okay, if not, we can move on to David's superintendent report for the month.
Thank you, Mr. Madden. First half of my report, we're joined by our Director of Public Works, Mrs. Danielle Floyd, who's going to give us an update as it relates to her department and some of the capital project that we're working on. Ms. Floyd, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I wanted to present this to the full Board of Managers. It was presented at County Council earlier today at the preliminary meeting. And I know it is our practice to be sure that we are also presenting these items to the Board of Managers. The timing was such that we wanted to be able to make this meeting because we are in the final stages of completing the drawings for the demolition of the JDC, and brought forward a request for council's consideration to amend the contract with the Spiesel Architectural Group, who I think everyone is aware was retained to provide the design documentation for the Juvenile Detention Center. If you recall, some of you may know that the scope of work that Spiesel is undertaking includes survey, environmental, mechanical, electrical, and architectural survey work, so that we can make sure we have documenting all of the existing conditions, the existing structure, and the existing systems of the buildings. We also asked them to retain a licensed plumber and electrician as part of that survey work. And there were follow-up assessments that were done. And it was identified during those follow-up assessments that the kitchen area was actually previously part of the Watkins building, which is now occupied by emergency services during the 1960s. And then when the county's juvenile detention center opened in the 70s, that kitchen area was no longer used at the Watkins building, then became used by the Juvenile Detention Center. we have working with Spiesel, we've determined that it would be best in order for us to also stay within budget to retain that portion of the building. And actually, it will be transitioned to additional storage for emergency services. So we also learned as part of that survey work that the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection systems in that kitchen space are being serviced by JDC. Obviously, when that building is no longer in place, those systems will need to be fed by the emergency services building. And so they have submitted a proposal for additional services to be sure that those details are noted on the design documentation. And it was presented this afternoon for council consideration. And I wanted to be sure that the Board of Managers, if you had any questions or concerns about us moving in that direction, that we had the opportunity to hear from you tonight. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Mrs. Floyd. Any questions for Danielle? Okay, hearing none. For the second half of my presentation, I just want to kind of give a quick, and I'm going to share my screen and bring this document up. Everybody see my screen? Hopefully y'all can see it.
Yeah, there we are.
Great. And just trying to be conscious of everybody's time, but I'd like to start our year off by just giving a short analysis of where our detention admissions were last year. I think it's important for us as a board to understand that context. I'm just going to give a quick analysis of that, and then we'll open up to any questions. And that would really conclude my presentation for the night. So again, when we look at our county's detention admissions for last year, on a weekly basis for 2023, we average around 7 young people who are in detention. That's identical to the prior year, which is 2022. The highest weekly census we saw in our reports were 10 detained youth. That was August of last year, which is actually a 17% decrease from 2022. 61% of our census remains that very serious young kid, which is our juvenile direct files. And that is actually up from 53% in 2022. So those numbers are actually trending up. In 2023, the highest amount of juvenile direct files detained we saw on our roster was 6. That was actually on 3 separate occasions. But again, that number is up 1 from the prior year. If you look at our chart to the right, the orange depicts the percentage of our young people who are that very serious juvenile direct file kid. And blue is our percentage of our traditional kind of detention kid. I think it's important for us as a board to understand that with, over 50% of our roster, closer to about 65% of our roster being that juvenile direct file, it makes it complicated in terms of some longer term partnerships when partnerships with our county may be more serious kids that are staying much longer than traditional detention youth. But again, this kind of depicts on a weekly basis what our roster looks like in terms of traditional and juvenile direct file youth. Again, our chart to the right, I sent you all this information prior, just get an idea of what I track on a weekly basis. You see highlighted in yellow in that middle column, which are juvenile direct file on 3 separate occasions. We reached that number 6 in our census as it relates to our direct files that are on the roster. I also track what percentage on a weekly basis our roster is that very serious kid. I think it's noteworthy to mention that, in our last 2 reports in December, that we had 0 direct files on our roster. And that's something that I hadn't seen since I've been here, since pretty much my 3rd week on the job. So for a 2-week period, over 50% of our roster was that very serious kid. Those numbers have completely diminished to 0. I think if those numbers continue to trend down, the likelihood of a partnership may increase. Again, just something to note that I think that our board should be aware of.
Dave, if I could just pause you for a moment there.
Sure.
Is there any, structural, for lack of a better way of saying it, reason why there might be, less youth in detention at the end of the year? Is there anything that kind of occurs that would make that the case, or is that just kind of random happenstance?
Well, again, I don't want to speculate, right? So I think it's a conversation I want to have in detail with our chief, just as it relates to why that juvenile direct file number kind of just dropped off the face of this earth. again, the adult trial period is much longer than the juvenile. So, these young people could have, been in the trial period for over a year and found guilty or non-guilty. And then, as it relates to our roster, it had a direct effect. I try to track on a monthly basis, again, what months per year do we have higher admissions? It seemed like September-ish was, the time of the year in which we see more kids coming in contact. December for me is a new trend, but it's maybe something to pay attention to. And we look at last year where September was our highest month, and this year, maybe it was December. Just something to pay attention to. But from the top of my head, Mr. Mann, I don't really have an answer as to, why our numbers were so low in December as it relates to other. We're looking into it. Again, so as it relates to our
Dave, can I-
mission, sure. Councilwoman?
So, yeah, do we track, sort of an average throughout the year of the children who are not detained, but are not detained because there's not a bed? So
Yes, we
so
do.
we've heard again and again that there are and do we have like a running total of that?
Yes, we do. It's a slide here, so we'll when we get to the
Okay.
slide, we'll address it. No worries. We can address any questions you have as it relates to that. So again, as it relates to our admissions, as it relates to gender, 61% of our population has been male, 39% female. I think again, it's noteworthy to mention that our male population is decreasing, but our female population every year is rising. 34% last year and 39% this year for our female population. When I started the job, there was essentially an 80-20 kind of split. So that's just something to pay attention to. The highest amount of young men that we've seen detention was 8 at one time. That's actually down 20%. It was 10 in 2022. And the highest amount of young female residents that were detained at one point in time were 4, and that's identical to 2022.
David, just to put that in context, I mean, we're talking about, 8 or 9 youth, a change percentage-wise of that sort. We're literally talking about like one
Agreed.
difference, right?
Agreed.
And I think the overall numbers have come down. So tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is probably that the female population hasn't necessarily gone up. It's just they've stayed flat and the male population has come down.
Agreed. And again, our female population as it relates to the juvenile direct file has been constant. And then again, so as it relates to our census, it's the same young lady who's been in detention all year because she's facing an adult charge. And it isn't essentially new faces, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
Again, next slide just kind of talks a bit about, and I know Councilwoman Schaefer mentioned some of this, but some of our departmental challenges has been finding the detention resource at the time of need. We'll go into this chart a bit, but I think from surface level, you see in the blue, these are young people that we've been able to provide secure space for in the time of need, and yellow depicts the incidents in which a young person scores for detention, and at the time we're unable to provide that what's needed. I think moving into this year, I'd like to take a bit more of analysis of the group in the yellow, right? I think we know anecdotally what the turnaway does in terms of staff morale, in terms of a lot of work that goes into folks scouring the state for beds and even sometimes outside the state. But I think if we want to look at the overall impact of the lack of detention here, it's really looking at that kid in the yellow, and it's following him or her to see, number one, did he or she show up to court? Did he go on to commit another offense that was serious and people related, or was he harmed? And I think if we have a better analysis of that, it gives us a better inference of, okay, the kid may have been turned away for detention, but was the resource actually needed as it relates to what detention guaranteed you? And it guarantees you a day in court, and guarantees you school every day, and it essentially at times it can keep you safe from yourself or someone else. As we summarize our needs for 2023, Roughly 25 reports from our partners at JPO reported incidents in which a young person committed an alleged offense and the resource of detention was not there. The average weekly turnaway as it relates to incidents was roughly 2, exactly 1.7. Most incidents that we've seen in a week at one point in time was 8. There were 8 incidents in which a young person scored for detention. We did not have that resource, and that's actually up 1 from 2022, which was 7. The highest weekly need we saw in 2023 was 15, and that's up from 2022, which was 11. We based the need off of the amount of beds we were able to supply, plus the incidents that were reported to us for turnaways, and that gives us an overall need. If you look at our average weekly need, it's been about 8 beds. So if you look at our chart to the right, you see on 2 separate occasions, one in February and one in August, in which it reported our highest need. And the one specifically in February was where 8 incidents in which kids were turned away. I also like to note that I also track the percentage of the time that what percent of the total need we're able to kind of supply. And it's noteworthy to note that close to 83% of the time we're able to, or 83% of the need we're able to supply on a weekly basis, which I think that's kudos to the folks who are making those calls. So essentially it's that 20% there that we have to find an answer to. But on the weekly basis, again, at least 80% of what's needed, we're able to supply that demand. That kind of sums up at least what from a high level of what we looked like for 2023. I know folks had some questions. I want to open up the questions and hopefully be able to answer them.
Yeah, so David, I guess the first question I would ask, first of all, thank you for the information. Does this information, and now having tracked it for 2 years, almost 3 years, does it change any portion of the strategy that we should be looking at as a board as it relates to both space, partnerships with community, et cetera, et cetera? So based on what you're seeing, should we be do we need to make a shift, or are we heading in the right direction?
Well, thanks, Rev. And it's closer. It's way closer to 2 years and 3 years. On the 4th, it made 2 years for us. So we got some ways before we have 3 years of data behind us. But yeah, so I think one of the main reasons why I track this data on the weekly basis is really, we talked about downsizing. I really wanted to make sure that we've never, for instance, if you look at our total turnaways and what our roster's been on a weekly basis, I want to make sure we're never exceeding the 18 beds that we're building here, right? Because if that trend becomes something that's reality, then obviously I have to bring that to the table and say, group, for X amount of weeks, we've been way over the 18 bed mark. Therefore, we may have to look at making sure Bob incorporates an extra bed or 2 based off the data. So just in terms of, for me, the actual need and the 18 bed facility, I think it still fits the overall vision. And again, I think when we put more sophisticated front end prevention and diversion in place, and when that stuff's working, it's only going to make that overall number go down as well. So I think we're still cooking with grease, Rev, to be specific.
And I think it's worth mentioning again that if and when there is a local detention facility, it's not as if the existing contracts that we have with non-county facilities just suddenly go away. So if we were to get to a place where we exceed our capacity, we could still lean into those contracts that we currently use.
Agreed.
So can I ask, when you say they score for detention, is there an actual score so that you could prioritize, if there aren't enough secure beds and some people have to go out on a monitor, how do you prioritize that? Is it a numeric score that, you could tell which ones are bigger risk than others?
Yeah, so our probation department uses the Padre tool, which is their standardized detention assessment. And I'm more than welcome to ask Chief DiMatteo to maybe give a presentation of what that looks like and how it's prioritized. Again, Councilwoman, it isn't me scoring young people. It's our court system and our probation department. But there is a standardized assessment tool that's used throughout the state. And to my knowledge, that is a tool that they're using as well.
I mean, I'm just thinking to the future, when
Yep.
we do have our own beds. And you know, it seems to be, from my vantage point, the kids that get turned away from the other facilities are the ones who have the more serious allegations against them. So I would assume they score worse on this test.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily something that's factual at this point. I think, you know, what I've seen is most young people, at least during the time we don't have a local resource, have all, you know, at least on our weekly roster or census, have all you know, alleged offenses have been pretty serious, right? So I don't think the fact that they've been turned away is because they are less or more serious. I just think at the time, the way it works, Councilwoman, at the time, we call everybody. If nobody has a space for us, then they're released with an alternative. Oftentimes it's a bracelet. And you know, I don't think for the most part we have the luxury of picking and choosing. You know, now I know our partners at the DA and probation have oftentimes released a young person who's currently in a facility, who may, you know, may not be prioritized in terms of a new offense that they're hearing about. And you know, I think that's kind of the trading, the musical chairs that's been happening here, and oftentimes we all hear about the frustration and the morale of our partners over there and what's going on, but it's essentially happened throughout the state. It isn't just Elko. You know, Dauphin County, a lot of folks are very frustrated with the current state of detention. Any other questions for me?
Well, just an observation, David, two things. There were statistics that I referenced several meetings ago about national studies done on what's happening with our youth here. And I think we ought to keep those in mind. I don't have any particular point to make from it, but there are a lot of national statistics about what's happening with our youth now.
Sure.
Second, the number of services that are provided before detention. So a juvenile is placed on probation and they're going to go with this service or that service. I think we ought to be aware of those services that are there and how those services may or may not be able to be useful to keep that young person from going to the next step, where they end up with serious charges and end up in detention. Just keeping an eye on those two things, the national statistics and the other services that are provided before a young person has to be in detention, but while they're on probation.
Thank you, Your Honor. And you may be happy to know that myself, the Chief DiMatteo, our Chief Public Defender of the Juvenile Unit, Lissa Poole, our Chief DA of the Juvenile Unit, Katie McGee, we all been, as well as our Stonely Fellow, Anne-Marie Ambrose, we all been meeting on a bi-weekly basis to really give a baseline analysis of what we have, you know, what assets do we have now that we can utilize, identify some gray areas, and really be able to bring those before council to put a lot more preventative and proactive programming in the community before they get to the point where they need detention. So I appreciate your comments and just letting you know it's in the works.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else for David? If not, any old business from board members for today? Any new business?
Kevin, I'd just like to acknowledge the county's new executive director, Mrs. Barbara O'Malley, who's on our call today. I know many of you may know her, but we have some board members who haven't had the opportunity to meet her. We've asked her to attend just to get get caught up on some of our concerns and what we're doing here as a board. So thank you, Mrs. O'Malley.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Councilwoman Schaefer, do we have any public comment in the room?
There is nobody in the room. Park Police, would you like to make a comment?
I hope the public is safely at home. Any other board member comment for today before we adjourn? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned for today.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody be safe.
Be safe.